The condensation on the glass of the beaker was the only thing Alina found reliable that Tuesday. It was predictably a simple matter of temperature differentials and atmospheric pressure outside the laboratory windows. The Seattle rain blurred the skyline into a charcoal smudge. But inside, under the hum of the fluorescent lights, everything had a place. Alina adjusted her glasses, her thumb tracing the edge of a glass slide. She was 34, and she had spent the better part of a decade mapping the cartography of the human brain. To her, heartbreak was simply a withdrawal syndrome, and longing was a predictable spike in dopamine coupled with a drop in serotonin. She needed a coffee, not for the ritual, but for the adenosine receptor antagonism. The cafe across from the university was loud, smelling of burnt milk and damp wool. Alina navigated the crowd with clinical efficiency until she found the last remaining stool at the far end of the bar. She didn't look at the person next to her until he spoke. "You look like you're calculating the trajectory of the steam," a voice said. It was low, vibrating with a warmth that felt out of place in the sterile chill of the afternoon. Alina turned. He wasn't her type if she believed in such a thing. He wore a canvas jacket stained with what looked like terracotta mud, and his hair was a chaotic map of wind-blown curls. He was holding a sketch pad, his fingers darkened by charcoal. "I was actually thinking about the molecular stability of the foam," Alina replied, her voice habitually flat. "It's collapsing faster than it should. Barista likely overheated the fats." The man laughed. It wasn't a polite chuckle. It was a full-bodied sound that made the air in Alina's chest feel suddenly tight. "I'm Julian. K, and I think the foam is just tired of holding itself up. It wants to be part of the coffee again." He leaned in slightly to show her his sketch. It wasn't a portrait or a landscape. It was a series of interlocking geometric shapes that somehow suggested a forest floor. Then it happened. Alina felt the distinct, sharp prickle at the base of her skull. Her heart rate, usually a steady 65 beats per minute, skipped, then accelerated into a light gallop. Her pupils dilated, pulling in more of the cafe's amber light than she actually needed. She recognized the surge instantly. It was the first spark molecule, the trace amine, that acted like a natural amphetamine. It was hitting her ventral tegmental area, flooding her system with a dangerous synthetic feeling euphoria. She looked at Julian's hands, the way the charcoal had settled into the lines of his skin, and felt a ridiculous, unscientific urge to touch them. "You're staring," Julian said, a lopsided grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Is there a biological reason for that, too?" Alina forced herself to blink, to breathe, to reestablish the boundary between the observer and the observed. "High levels of phenylethylamine," she said, her voice betraying her with a slight tremor. "It's a stimulant. It's currently causing a mild state of intoxication in my prefrontal cortex." Julian didn't look confused or put off. He simply closed his sketchbook and turned his stool toward her, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifyingly focused intensity. "Intoxication, huh?" he murmured. "Dr. Chemistry, I've always preferred the high over the lecture. Should I get us another round of whatever is causing it? Or are you going to keep analyzing the bubbles?" Alina looked at her coffee, then back at the man who was currently rewiring her nervous system without a permit. For the first time in years, the data didn't matter. "Julian," she said, testing the weight of the name. "I think the bubbles can wait." The air in Julian's studio smelled of cedar mulch, tea, MP graphite, and the sharp metallic temps of a soldering iron. It was a chaotic ecosystem. The antithesis of Elena's sterile, pressurized lab, yet she found herself drawn to it 3 nights a week. She sat on a stool made of reclaimed oak, watching Julian bend over a scale model of a rooftop garden. The way he moved was fluid, unbothered by the precise measurements that governed her life. To him, a millimeter was a suggestion. To her, it was a margin of error that could ruin a month's worth of culture growth. "You're doing it again?" Julian said, not looking up from a miniature Japanese maple he was positioning with tweezers. "Doing what?" "Collecting data." "You have that look in your eyes, like you're counting my breaths." Alina shifted, the leather of her jacket creaking. He wasn't wrong. Internally, she was noting the slight tremor in her own hands and the way her peripheral vision seemed to sharpen whenever he stepped into her personal space. "I'm just observing the process," she lied. Later that night, back in her apartment, the silence was heavy. Alina didn't go to sleep. She couldn't. The phenylethylamine was a relentless engine in her bloodstream. $C_8H_11N, acting as a precursor to dopamine, keeping her in a state of hypervigilance. She opened her laptop, the blue light washing over her face, and pulled up a password-protected spreadsheet. The file was titled M Subject E, Acute Phase Analysis, M. Under the column for M Week 3, M, she typed M, persistent tachycardia 88 BPM, resting. Decreased caloric requirement, appetite suppressed, cognitive narrowing, 85% of intrusive thoughts centered on subject JM. She stared at the screen. It was an addiction, pure and simple. If she saw this data in a lab rat, she'd label it chemical intoxication and begin the weaning process. But when Julian texted her a simple photo of a sunset over the sound, the spike in her chest was so violent it felt like a physical blow. She didn't want the cure. Sue wanted the saturation. The next morning, the university lab felt smaller than usual. Alina stood before her team, her eyes slightly bloodshot from the 3 a.m. data entry. "The goal for this quarter is simple," she told her assistants. Her voice regained its professional edge. "We are looking for the persistence factor. We know how the initial spark works. We know how the $P flood hits the receptors. What we don't know what the industry is desperate to find. This how to prevent the inevitable crash. How do we keep the saturation point from becoming a plateau? As she spoke, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Lunch. Julian had sent. Alina felt the familiar rush, the dizzying climb of the chemical wave. She looked at her research notes, the graphs showing the sharp decline of $P after 6 months' end. Then at the glowing screen of her phone. Take the lead on the titration, Sarah, Alina said, grabbing her bag. Aha! I have a field observation. She walked out of the lab, her heart rate already climbing to 90. She was a scientist, she reminded herself. She was just studying the fire while she was standing in the middle of it. The conference room smelled of stale ozone and expensive upholstery. Dr. Uris, the department head, leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers steepled. On the screen behind Alina, a series of complex graphs pulsed in neon blue, showing the decay of attachment markers in test subjects over an 18-month period. The board is concerned with the spark gap, Alina, Eris said, his voice as dry as the papers on his desk. Your proposal to synthesize a long-term attachment catalyst is ambitious, but we need more than just theory. We need a demonstration of sustainability. If you can show how to bridge the gap between the initial $PEA surge and the steady state of oxytocin. The funding goes to the Alzheimer's Initiative. Alina felt a familiar tightening in her jaw. The chemistry is there, Dr. Eris. The issue isn't the molecules, it's the receptors. We are trying to keep a high-voltage system running on a low-voltage grid. I just need more time to calibrate the delivery. You have 6 weeks, Eris replied, already looking down at his tablet. Find a way to make the feeling stay, or pack up the lab. 2 hours later, Lena was standing in the middle of a half-finished public park, the scent of fresh mulch and diesel exhaust swirling around her. Julian was on his knees in a trench, his hands buried in dark, loamy soil. He looked up, his face smudged with dirt, and gave her a grin that made her internal chemistry scramble like a poorly tuned radio. You're late, he said, standing up and wiping his hands on his thighs. The sunset doesn't wait for lab results. The meeting ran long, Alina said, her eyes tracing the way the late afternoon light caught the gold in his iris. She felt the urge to reach out and check his pulse, to see if his $P levels were mirroring her own. Julian, can I ask you something? When you're designing a space like this, do you ever calculate the emotional ROI? Julian paused, a small puzzled frown forming. The what? The return on investment. Do you measure how long a person stays in a specific area based on the visual stimuli? Is there a formula for the piece you're trying to build? Julian let out a short, puffing laugh. He stepped closer, the heat radiating off his body in waves. No, Elle. I just feel where the light hits. I plant things where they want to grow. You can put a formula on how a garden makes you feel at 5 in the morning when the mist is still up. He reached out, his thumb brushing a stray hair from her forehead. His touch was warm, gritty with soil. Alina froze. She wasn't thinking about the touch. She was thinking about the tactile receptors sending signals to her somatosensory cortex. You're doing it again? Julian whispered, his smile fading slightly. You're looking at me like I'm a specimen under a lens. Like you're waiting for me to react so you can write it down. I'm not, Lena lied, though her mind was already categorizing the dilation of his pupils as a positive feedback loop. I'm not a set of data points, Julian said, his voice dropping an octave. He took a step back, the physical distance feeling like a sudden drop in temperature. I'm the guy who's falling for you. There's a difference. He turned back to his trench, the silence between them suddenly heavy with something chemistry couldn't quite explain. Alina stood there, the cool wind biting at her neck, feeling the agonizing conflict between the woman who wanted to love him and the scientist who wanted to solve him. In her pocket, her phone vibrated with a notification from the lab's automated monitoring system. Titration successful. Stability achieved. She looked at Julian's back, at the dirt on his jacket, and felt a hollow ache in her chest. She had achieved stability in the lab, but out here in the real world, the ground was starting to shift. The dishwasher hummed in a low rhythmic thrum that Alina had once found soothing. But tonight, it sounded like a ticking clock. It had been exactly 14 months since the cafe, and the world had lost its jagged, electric edges. She sat at the kitchen island, a glass of wine untouched beside her laptop. Julian was in the living room, sprawled on the sofa with a book on urban rewilding. He looked comfortable. He looked settled. He looked predictable. Alina looked at her smartwatch. Heart rate 68 BPM. A year ago, just the sound of his key in the lock would have sent her into the high 80s. Now her cardiovascular system remains stubbornly indifferent. She opened the spreadsheet that had become her secret confession, scrolling down to the latest entry. Month 14, metabolic baseline reached, P levels likely at pre-exposure levels. Visual stimuli subject J no longer triggering acute catecholamine release. Transition to the plateau phase complete. She felt a cold clinical knot of dread. In her lab, stability was the goal. In her life, it felt like a funeral. You've been staring at that screen for 20 minutes, Julian said, not looking up from his book. Is the data that interesting? Or are you just hiding from the fact that it's your turn to do the compost? I'm not hiding, she said, her voice sounding thin to her own ears. Julian finally looked up, his expression softening into that easy, warm smile that used to make her dizzy. Now it just felt like a soft blanket, nice, but lacking the heat of a flame. He stood up, crossing the room with the familiar gait she could now identify by sound alone. He squeezed her shoulder as he passed, a brief, affectionate touch. Lena didn't lean into it. She was too busy analyzing the lack of a shiver. "You're quiet tonight," he murmured, leaning against the counter. He smelled of pine sawdust and the sultan vinegar chips he'd been snacking on. "Talk to me. Use your big scientist words." "I was thinking about habituation," Alina said, her fingers hovering over the keys. "How the brain eventually ignores any constant stimulus to save energy. Like how you stop smelling the perfume you wear every day." Julian's smile faltered. "Just a fraction. Is that what this is? We're just constant stimuli now. It's biological, Julian. It's how we're wired." The $C_8H_11N surge, the euphoria, wasn't meant to last. It's too metabolic expensive. The body has to downregulate. Julian set his book down on the counter with a soft thud. The playful light in his eyes was replaced by something sharper. Something more guarded. I don't care about the downregulation, Elle. I care that when I touch your shoulder, you look like you're calculating a grocery list. I'm calculating our survival." She snapped, finally closing the laptop. "If the chemistry is gone, what's left? If we aren't high on each other anymore, aren't we just roommates who share a bed?" The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the sloshing of the dishwasher. Julian looked at her for a long time, his jaw tight. "Is that all it was to you?" he asked quietly. "A hit of dopamine. 'Cause for me, the part where the high wears off is where the real story actually starts. It's where you decide to stay because you actually like the person. Not just the way they make your brain leak chemicals." He turned and walked toward the bedroom, leaving her alone in the kitchen. Alina looked down at her hands. They weren't shaking. Her heart was steady. According to every metric she had spent her life studying, she was perfectly healthy. So why did it feel like she was suffocating in the vacuum of her own objectivity? The air in the climbing gym was thick with the scent of pulverized chalk and the sour, rubbery tank of rental shoes. It was a cavern of primary colors and synthetic holds. A deliberate choice for Elena's intervention. She stood at the base of a vertical wall, her harness biting into her hips. Her palms were sweating not from the heat, but from the calculated anticipation. "You're sure about this?" Julian asked, tightening his belay device. He looked out of place in the neon-lit gym, his natural rhythm better suited to the slow growth of a garden than the frantic, twitchy energy of a rock wall. "I thought we were going to that jazz club you liked. Music is passive," Alina said, her voice tight as she checked her smartwatch. "Heart rate, 74 BPM. We need something visceral, Julian. Something that forces the sympathetic nervous system to engage." She didn't tell him that she had spent the morning reviewing the 1974 Capilano suspension bridge study. The theory was simple: misattribution of arousal. If she could put them in a high-anxiety environment, Their brains might mistake the racing hearts and shaky breaths for the spark of attraction they had lost. She was trying to trick her own biology into a relapse. "Just climb, Elle," Julian said, his eyes searching hers for a trace of the woman who used to look at him without a stopwatch in her hand. "Don't analyze the friction. Just move." Alina started up the wall. Every muscle in her forearms burned. As she reached the midway point, 15 feet above the padded floor, she forced herself to look down. The height triggered a primal spike of cortisol. Her vision tunneled. Her heart began a frantic thudding rhythm against her ribs. Heart rate 112 BPM. She reached for a blue hold, her fingers trembling. This was it. The surge. The flood of norepinephrine. When she finally lowered back to the ground, gasping for air, she threw herself into Julian's arms. She kissed him with a sudden, desperate hunger. For a fleeting second, it worked. The adrenaline mimicked the old euphoria. The world blurred at the edges, and for a heartbeat, she felt the spark. "Whoa," Julian whispered, pulling back slightly, his hands steady on her waist. That was intense. It was perfect. Alina breathed, her eyes bright. "Do you feel it? The rush." "It's exactly like the first month." Julian's expression shifted from surprise to a slow, cooling realization. The warmth drained from his face. "Is that what this is? A titration?" "Shh, Julian, I'm trying to save us," Alina said, the words tumbling out too fast. "If we can trigger these spikes regularly, we can bypass the habituation phase. We can stay in the honeymoon phase indefinitely." Julian let go of her waist. He took a step back, the neon lights overhead making him look suddenly tired. "You're not trying to save us, Elle. You're trying to save a feeling. You're treating our relationship like a failing experiment that needs a higher dosage. Chemistry is the only thing that's real." The adrenaline still coursing through her, making her voice sharper than she intended. "No," Julian said, his voice quiet, almost drowned out by the shout of a nearby climber. "The chemistry is the weather. The relationship is the house. And you so busy trying to manufacture a thunderstorm that you letting the roof rot?" He didn't wait for her to respond. He started unlooping the rope from his harness, his movements jerky and final. Lena stood in the middle of the gym, her heart rate slowly dropping, watching the high evaporate to reveal a cold, hollow floor. The rain in Seattle didn't fall so much as it drifted, a fine gray mist that clung to the windows like a shroud. Inside the apartment, the silence was sharp. Elena found him in her study. He wasn't sketching. He wasn't reading. He was sitting in her ergonomic office chair, the blue light of her dual monitors reflecting in the dark glass of his eyes. On the left screen was a 3D rendering of a neural pathway. On the right was the spreadsheet. Longitudinal observations. Elena's breath hitched in her throat. A physical catch that no amount of respiratory control could smooth over. She had left it open. She had been so caught up in the gym data from the night before that she had unclicked minimize. Julian didn't look up when she entered. He was scrolling. Slowly, Chapter 2, he said, his voice a flat, hollowed-out version of itself. Subject J displays increased pupillary dilation when discussing the Highline Project. Correlates with elevated oxytocin release. Recommendation: engage in further spatial design dialogue to maintain receptivity. Julian Alina started, her hands reaching out into the empty air between them. It's not. It's a framework. It's how I process you rated our first weekend in the mountains. He interrupted, finally looking at her. The warmth that usually defined his face was gone, replaced by a crystalline, fragile sort of anger. You gave it a 7 out of 10 for chemical intensity. You noted that my vulnerability markers were high after I told you about my father's workshop. He stood up. The chair rolling back and hitting the mahogany bookshelf with a dull M thud. I thought we were connecting, he whispered, the words jagged. I thought I was sharing my life with someone. But I was just providing you with a better sample size, wasn't I? Every time I looked at you and felt lucky, you were just checking your watch to see if my pulse was fast enough for your records. I was trying to understand. Alina cried, her professional veneer finally cracking. The show don't tell of her panic was in the way she began to pace the small room, her fingers twisting the hem of her lab coat. I was terrified, Julian. I've spent my life watching these molecules die. I've watched the spark vanish in hundreds of subjects. I didn't want it to happen to us. I thought if I mapped ITIF, I knew where the cliffs were. I could keep us on the path. You can't map a person. You can only map a ghost. Julian walked over to the desk and picked up a printed draft of her funding proposal. He didn't tear it. He'd just held it, his thumb tracing the title, M. Synthetic Persistence in Non-Clinical Romantic Attachments. Was any of it real? He asked, his voice breaking. Or was the whole year just a titration? Did you love me? Or did you just love the way your brain reacted to me? Alina opened her mouth to speak, but the words felt like ash. She looked at him looked at him man for the first time. She didn't see a subject. She didn't see a dopamine spike or a $PEA saturation curve. So, a man who was grieving a relationship that hadn't even ended yet. Her own internal monitor, the one she could never quite turn off registered, a strange cold sensation. It wasn't the fight or flight of adrenaline. It was the heavy leaden sink of a cortisol crash. The withdrawal. Julian, please, she whispered. He set the paper back down. Can't stay here, every time you look at me now. I'm going to wonder if you're listening to what I'm saying, or if you're just waiting for a chemical signal. He walked past her. He didn't grab a suitcase. He just grabbed his canvas jacket, the one still stained with the mud of the park they had built together. The front door clicked shut with a finality that echoed through the hollow spaces of the apartment. Alina sat in the chair he had just vacated. The blue light of the monitor stayed on. The cursor in the M_JM spreadsheet blinking steadily, waiting for the next data point. But for the first time in her life, the scientist had nothing left to record. The silence in the apartment was no longer the peaceful quiet of a shared evening. It was the heavy, pressurized stillness of a vacuum. Lena stood in the kitchen, her hand hovering over the kettle. She found herself counting the seconds it took for the water to boil, a reflex she couldn't suppress. She hadn't heard from Julian in 4 days. No texts, no photos of curiously shaped leaves, no invitations to drink terrible coffee. Her body was in a state of chemical mourning. The crash she had spent years documenting in others was now her own physical reality. Without the constant stimulus of Julian's presence, her $P levels had bottomed out. She felt a pervasive leaden lethargia, mourning for the high she had tried so desperately to manufacture. On the 5th day, she returned to the university. The lab was humming with activity. Sarah, her lead assistant, looked up from a microscope with an expression of cautious triumph. Lena, you need to see the latest titration results from the bonding series, Sarah said. Alina leaned over the monitor. The graph was different from the sharp, jagged spikes of the attraction phase. It was a long, steady, horizontal line and exciting, monochromatic, and completely stable. It was the signature of oxytocin. It's not flashy, Sarah noted, tapping the screen. There's no euphoria, no spark markers. But the social cohesion in the subjects is at 98%. They aren't excited, Alina. They're just safe. They've stopped looking for other stimuli. They've settled. Alina stared at the line. This was the persistence factor the board wanted. It was the chemistry of the long haul. It was the molecular equivalent of the way Julian looked at her when she was frustrated with her research, not with the fire of a new lover, but with the steady, quiet gravity of a partner. She realized then that she had been addicted to the lightning, completely ignoring the hearth. She had been so focused on $P, the molecule of want, that she had neglected oxytocin, the molecule of belonging. It's boring, Alina whispered. What? Sarah asked. Alina said, her voice cracking. It's boring because it isn't a drug. It's a choice. You don't feel it like a hit. You feel it like a foundation. She walked away from the monitor and went into her private office. She opened a drawer and pulled out a small dried sprig of lavender Julian had given her months ago. He'd told her it was good for the stress of being too smart. She closed her eyes and inhaled. The scent was faint, nearly gone, but it triggered a memory of a Tuesday night when they had done nothing but sit on the porch and watch the fog roll in. Her heart rate had been 62 beats per minute. She had recorded it as a failure of stimulus in her spreadsheet. Now, she realized it had been the most successful moment of her life. She picked up her phone. She didn't check her heart rate. She didn't look at her sleep data. She opened her messages and typed a single sentence, knowing that the chemistry wouldn't save her this time only, the truth would. I was looking for the wrong molecule, Julian. She hit send. Then she did something she hadn't done since she was a child. She sat in the silence and simply waited, without a single lens between her and the world. The university lab felt like a cathedral of cold glass and silent intentions. For 3 days, Elena's phone had remained a black rectangular void on her desk. No response. The delivered status on her message was a digital scar. Proof that her words had reached him and were simply being left to wither in the ether. She threw herself into the bonding series with a ferocity that worried her assistants. She arrived at 6 a.m. before the HVAC system had fully kicked in, working in a sweater that smelled faintly of Julian's laundry detergent. It was a sensory ghost that she couldn't scrub away. "The board is coming in at noon, Alina," Sarah said, standing by the centrifuge. "The data looks perfect. Okay. The oxytocin vasopressin synthesis is holding.
Hey.
It's exactly what they asked for: sustained low variance. Attachment." Alina looked at the screen.
Okay.
The lines were beautiful. They were steady.
Okay.
They were a flat line of emotional safety. "It's a graveyard," Alina murmured.
Lydia.
Sarah. Alina pointed to a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker in the baseline of a previous non-synthesized study, a control group of natural couples. "That's noise. In the lab, we call it interference. But in a life, that's the sound of a door opening. That's the sound of an argument that ends in a laugh. We've filtered out the noise, and now there's nothing left to hear." At noon, the room was filled with the heavyweights of the pharmaceutical department and the primary investors. Dr. Aris looked pleased, his spectacles reflecting the glow of Elena's presentation. "So, Dr. Vance," one of the investors said, leaning forward, "you're saying we can effectively level out the volatility of romantic relationships? We can bypass the $P crash and move straight into the stability of long-term bonding." "We can," Alina said. Her voice felt like it was coming from a great distance. "We can create a state where the crash never happens because the high was never allowed to peak. It's a perfectly managed, chemically buffered existence. It's a breakthrough," Aris beamed. "Think of the social applications. The reduction in divorce rates. The increase in household stability." Alina looked at the back of the room. You imagine Julian standing there, his canvas jacket covered in cedar dust, looking at these men with that tilted, skeptical grin of his. You would hate this. You would say they were trying to pave over the forest so people would untrip on the roots. "It's a lobotomy of the soul," Alina said, her voice suddenly clear and sharp. The room went silent. Dr. Aris's smile didn't just fade, It evaporated. I've spent the last year trying to solve for the spark gap, Alina continued, ignoring Arisa's warning glance. But I realized that the gap isn't a flaw in the system. It's the point. You can't have the heat of the fire without the consumption of the fuel. If you stabilize the reaction too much, you're just left with a cold hearth. She gathered her tablet, her hands finally steady. The research is sound, but the application is a mistake. You can't synthesize the choice to stay. That part isn't in the molecules. It's in the noise. She walked out before the questions could start. She didn't go to her car. She walked toward the campus gardens, toward the places where things grew without a titration schedule. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Heart, that traitorous muscle, spiked to 95 BPM before she even saw the screen. I'm at the park. The message read, the one with the drainage issues. I'm fixing the roots. If you want to talk about noise, come find me. He looked exhausted, his canvas jacket soaked through. But there was a focus in his movements that Alina had always envied. He didn't need a monitor to tell him if he was working hard. He just felt the resistance of the clay. She stood at the edge of the trench, her polished lab shoes sinking into the soft perimeter. The drainage is worse than you thought, she said, her voice barely carrying over the distant hum of city traffic. Julian stopped. He didn't look up immediately. He leaned on the handle of the shovel, his breath coming in visible plumes of white vapor. The soil is compacted, he said, finally turning to face her. No matter how much water you pour on top, it won't take. It just pools until it turns into a swamp. You have to break the hardpan first. He climbed out of the pit, his movements stiff. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked at her without the shield of a computer screen between them. I left the presentation, Alina said. She reached for her wrist, a muscle memory reflex to check her heart rate, but she forced her hand back down to her side.
Ow.
I told them the synthesis was a mistake. Julian's eyebrows quirked, a ghost of his old lopsided grin appearing. The board didn't like that, I assume. Eris looked like he was having a stroke, she admitted, a small, genuine laugh escaping her. But I realized something while I was looking at the graphs. I was trying to solve for the spark gap because I was afraid of the dark. I thought if the chemistry faded, there would be nothing left but silence. She took a step closer, the mud sucking at her heels. But the silence is where the work happens. Like you and this park. The excitement of the design is over, and now you're just in the mud, fixing the roots so things can actually grow. That's the part I didn't include in my spreadsheet. The part that isn't a reaction, but a choice. Julian watched her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. I'm not a steady baseline, Elle. I'm messy. I'm going to forget to do the compost. And I'm going to get obsessed with a project and stay out until midnight. And I'm going to say things that make your $P levels bottom out. I know, Alina said. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold, damp sleeve of his jacket. And I'm going to try to analyze every fight we have. I'm going to want to categorize your moods and find a biological reason for why you re-annoyed with me. I'm a scientist, Julian. I can't turn off the how. But I'm learning that the how doesn't explain the why. Julian looked down at her hand on his arm. He didn't pull away. Instead, he reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his thumb leaving a small, dark smudge of earth on her temple. The why is the noise, he whispered. It's the part that doesn't fit the curve. He didn't kiss her with the frantic, adrenaline-fueled desperation of the climbing gym. He kissed her slowly, a quiet, intentional movement that felt less like a spark and more like a bridge being built. Lena didn't check her watch. She didn't count her heartbeats. She simply stood in the mud, in the cold Seattle rain, and felt the weight of another person, perfect, unquantifiable, and entirely necessary. 6 months later, the spreadsheet was gone. In its place was a physical journal with a frayed spine and tea-stained edges, kept in the drawer of Elena's bedside table. It contained no data points, no heart rate averages, and no chemical formulas. It contained observations of a different kind. The way the light hit the kitchen tiles at 7 a.m. The specific sound of Julian's whistle when he was frustrated with a design. And the list of plants they had successfully kept alive in their small balcony garden. Lena stood in the university hallway, pausing before the glass door of her new lab. The sign had changed. It no longer read neurochemistry of attachment. It now read the biochemistry of social resilience. She had lost her primary funding, just as she expected. Aries had been furious, calling her scientifically irresponsible. But a smaller, private foundation, one focused on long-term mental health and community structures, had picked up her contract. They weren't interested in synthesizing a spark. They wanted to understand the glue, Alina. The results from the longitudinal study on co-regulation are in, Sarah said, walking alongside her. Sarah looked different, too less like a frantic technician and more like a collaborator. Alina glanced at the monitor. The graphs didn't have the violent, beautiful peaks of phenylethylamine. They were undulating waves, gentle and rhythmic, showing how two people's nervous systems eventually learned to breathe in sync. It's beautiful, Alina said, and she meant it. It's not a high. It's a resonance. When she got home that evening, the apartment didn't feel like a vacuum. It felt like a workshop. There were boots by the door, a pile of mail on the counter, and the smell of roasting garlic and rosemary. Julian was in the kitchen, leaning over a pot of pasta. He looked up as she entered, and for a split second, Alina felt the ghost of the old $P spike of faint, flickering warmth in her chest. But it didn't overwhelm her. It didn't make her want to reach for a stopwatch. It just felt like coming home. "You're late," he said, but there was no edge to it. He walked over and kissed her cheek. His skin was warm, smelling of the outdoors and the cheap soap he used at the park site. "The resonance study is showing promise," Alina said, leaning her head against his shoulder for a moment. She could feel his heartbeat steady, rhythmic, and entirely uncalculated. "Is that the one about how people become part of each other's baselines?" Julian asked, stirring the sauce. "Essentially. Fate, the theory that love isn't something that happens to you. It's something you build, day by day, through the boring stuff, the chores, the silences, the showing up when you'd rather be anywhere else." Julian turned off the burner and looked at her. The lopsided grin was there, but it was deeper now, etched with the reality of the last 6 months. "Sounds like a lot of work for a scientist." "It's the hardest work I've ever done," Alina admitted. She reached out and took the spoon from his hand, setting it on the rest. "But the data is conclusive. The spark is just the invitation. This the noise, the mud, the pasta, this is the party." They ate dinner in the living room, the city lights of Seattle blurring into a familiar bokeh through the rain-streaked windows. There were no grand declarations, no cinematic revelations. There was just the clink of forks against ceramic and the low hum of a conversation that didn't need to be recorded to be remembered. Alina looked at Julian, his messy hair, the charcoal stain on his thumb, the way he listened more than he spoke. Her internal monitor registered a heart rate of 64 beats per minute. She was calm. She was grounded. She was, for the first time in her life, exactly where she was supposed to be. The love molecule was a brilliant, fleeting firework. But as she watched Julian laugh at a story she was telling, Alina realized she much preferred the steady, enduring glow of the coals. The experiment was over. The life had finally begun.